Welcome to another episode of the PFF College Football Show. Max Chadwick alongside Dalton Wasserman here with my top 10 defensive lines in college football entering the 2025 season. And Dalton, we've seen it time and time again. A great defensive line can destroy an offensive game plan. I don't care how good your quarterback, receiving core, running backs are. If you can't block a defensive line and hold up in pass protection or open up holes in the run game, you saw what the Eagles did to the Super Bowl. You saw what Michigan did to Ohio State last year, and Michigan winning a national title off their defensive line, really. It just shows how dominant a defensive line is, can really lead to a lot of victories for a team.
Yeah, look, everything starts up front in the trenches, right? We mentioned it last week in the offensive line episode, how important that is. But, man, if you can get after it on the defensive line, especially with your front four, look at the two national champions that we've covered since doing this show. Michigan and Mason Graham and all those guys and Kenneth Grant that they had. And last year, that front four that Ohio State has, I would argue that was the best in the country with Sawyer and Tuamoloau, Tyleik Williams, right? I mean, they just had such an unblockable unit, even for an elite offensive line when they were playing Texas and Notre Dame, Penn State, and teams like that. So I think when you have that defensive line that can disrupt everything, it almost, when you're that good, it takes scheme out of it. You just go, man, how in the world do we block these four guys on top of all the other athletes coming behind them?
So we're going to break down my top 10 defensive lines in college football. We already broke down my top 10 defensive tackles and edge defenders. If you want to go see the individual lists available on this channel, now is going over the unit. Which school has the best defensive line in the nation? I want to remind you guys, a lot of the numbers we're talking about today and using all these stats to make these lists are available to you guys with a PFF Plus subscription at subscribe.pff.com, where you get metrics on every single player and team in college football, every single player and team in the NFL, and you get access to our 2026 NFL mock draft simulator, where you can draft a full 5 rounds for your favorite team with the best prospects in next year's draft. A lot of them defensive linemen too. So let's go over with my honorable mention defensive line, and that is the Oregon Ducks, who just missed out on being in the top 10 of this list. And Oregon is the only school we're talking about today on this list that does not have a top 10 edge rusher or a top 10 defensive tackle for me in my ranking, but still deserve a shout out here, in my opinion. Mateo Uiagalelei, potential first-round pick in the 2026 NFL Draft. He tied for 6th among Big Ten edge rushers last year with 9 sacks. Opposite of him is Tatum Tuioti, who is 10th in the Big Ten with a 78.3 pass rush grade. Oregon will miss Derek Harmon, who was a first-round pick at defensive tackle, but they did add Bear Alexander from the transfer portal to help make up for it. He had 32 pressures in 2023 while at USC. That was second among Pac-12 defensive tackles that year. And then Amari Washington will likely start next to Bear Alexander at D-tackle. He played 298 snaps for Oregon last year. So really good edge duo in Mateo Uiagalelei and Tatum Tuioti. And then I think a guy with a lot of potential in Bear Alexander. Kind of want to see him stay on the field a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you have is a group that maybe doesn't have one superstar player that defines what the group is, but they see under Dan Lanning, right, just like when he was running the defense at Georgia, they just seem to play so much better as a unit. It's greater than the sum of their parts, and still some really talented players. I'm sure if you extended the edge unit or the edge position rankings and D tackles, you'd get some of those players into a top 20 most likely. So they're not that far off. They still have a lot of talent as a group, and they're going to cause a lot of problems up front.
Uiagalelei barely missed out on me in my top 10. I know a lot of people in the comments were not very happy that Uiagalelei was not in my top 10 edge rushers, but he is still a very talented player. And then, like I said before, you could bring back Tatum Tuioti, too, as one of your starting edge rushers who had a good year last year. Excited about that. And then Bear Alexander, really excited to see what he could do at Oregon next year, which should be the best environment he's been in for a few years now in Oregon. So honorable mention was Oregon. Number 10 is Texas, who in my opinion have the best edge rusher in college football, in Colin Simmons, who's only a true sophomore right now. Former 5-star recruit, he hit the ground running in Austin as a true freshman. He finished 2024 as the 6th most valuable edge defender in college football, according to our wins above average metric, and the only 5 above him were drafted in the first 4 rounds of the 2025 draft in Abdul Carter, Jack Sawyer, Mike Green, Josiah Stewart, and JT Tuimoloau. So you remove those 5 guys who are all in the draft in the first 4 rounds, and Colin Simmons is right behind them as a true freshman last year. They did add Cole Brevard from Purdue at defensive tackle. He was 12th in the Big Ten with a 75 PFF grade last year. Travis Shaw also transferred in at defensive tackle from North Carolina. He was 16th among ACC defensive tackles last year with 15 defensive stops. And they also brought back senior edge defender Ethan Burke, who played 324 snaps last year. And Texas brought in a couple 5-star recruits on the defensive line in D tackle Justice Terry and edge defender Lance Jackson. Terry, the number 2 D tackle in the country coming out of high school, and Lance Jackson, number 2 edge rusher in the country coming out of high school. And I don't know if you saw the picture, Dalton, of Justice Terry recently. That is a grown man.
Yeah,
that is a grown man.
That's what offenses call a problem.
Yeah. So he should immediately be seeing a lot of playing time as a true freshman, I think, for Texas next year. I do want to mention this too. Trey Moore started at edge defender for Texas last year and actually had a really good year at Texas with 8 sacks last year. It was 10th in the SEC. He is back on that defense, but he will be playing off-ball linebacker next to Anthony Hill Jr. next year. So he's still probably going to play some snaps at edge rusher, but mostly will be an off-ball linebacker. If he was still playing edge rusher, Texas would probably be a little bit higher on this list, but the fact that they lose one of the starting edge rushers playing a different position next year is why they're here at number 10.
It's an interesting development there, isn't it? Because across his time at UTSA and with Texas, he was a really good edge defender. So the idea, they must love their defensive line depth, obviously, behind Colin Simmons enough to move Trey Moore back there to linebacker. They lost David Benda to the NFL. Now you get Moore next to Anthony Hill. But, I mean, the headliner here is Colin Simmons. Your number 1 edge defender in the country. Just an absolute freak of nature. The best outside linebacker, pass rusher from a 2-point stance we have in college football right now. A freaky freshman season. He's going to only be even better. If you don't double and triple team Colin Simmons, I don't really know what you're doing as an offense. I got to be honest with you. It starts there, and then but they've had defensive line talent just rolling through the last few years. You mentioned Justice Terry, another talented defensive tackle. After they've had so many taken early in these drafts the last few years, I mean, Texas now is becoming one of the defensive line factories in college football. They got a young unit this year, and you mentioned Trey Moore moving back to linebacker, but they're still extremely talented.
Absolutely. Texas, big reason why they're here at number 10 is because of Colin Simmons, but I did like the transfers they brought in at D-tackle. I still like Ethan Burke there. Maybe Trey Moore can still play a little edge defender for them next year. And then, of course, they brought in 2 5-stars on the defensive line as well. Why they're here at number 10 on this list. At number 9 is Texas's arch rival, the Oklahoma Sooners here. Plenty of experience on Oklahoma's defensive line. In fact, they brought back 4 defensive linemen who played at least 300 snaps for them last year. Grayson Halton, my number 10 defensive tackle in college football. He has a 13.6% pressure rate over the last 2 years. That leads all returning defensive tackles in college football. 12.5% pass rush win rate over the last 2 years is the best among returning Power 4 interior defenders. R. Mason Thomas, also a terrific pass rusher and edge defender. In fact, he was second among all edge rushers in the country last year with a 93.2 pass rush grade on true passes. The only one above him was Josiah Stewart, who is now in the NFL. You got Dominic Williams coming back at D-tackle. He was 14th in the SEC last year with a 77.3 run defense grade. Marvin Jones Jr. will be starting at edge rusher, transferring in from Florida State. He played 387 snaps for Florida State last year. And Oklahoma also has a couple of former top 10 overall recruits coming out of high school, an edge defender, Adepoju Adebawore, who's a junior, and then also a sophomore and D-tackle David Stone. So a lot of talent on Oklahoma's defensive line and a lot of depth on Oklahoma's defensive line too.
I think it starts with the pass rush talent, right? When you talk about R. Mason Thomas having an 88 pass rush grade and Grayson Halton shows a lot of flashes as a pass rusher. You mentioned those are the 2 stars of the group. I think if you get in obvious passing situations against Oklahoma, you're going to have a serious problem. A, between their defensive line being so talented as pass rushers, and B, we know what Brent Venables can bring with the blitz packages and disguises and everything he can do on defense. So I think if you want to beat Oklahoma and this defensive line that is extremely talented, you better run it right down their throat, because if you get in obvious passing situations, you're going to have a real problem.
Yeah, definitely. I really like what Oklahoma has on the defensive line right now. Grayson Holm, again, a top 10 player for me at D-tackle. R. Mason Thomas could have had an argument to be a top 10 edge rusher for me, too. He's one of the best pass rushers in America, and then a lot of depth on that defensive line, too. So number 9 is Oklahoma. Number 8 is Miami, who has a guy in Ruben Bain Jr., my number 4 edge rusher in the country, and a lot of people think he will be a top 15 pick in the 2026 NFL Draft. He was third among returning power 4 edge defenders over the last 2 years with 73 pressures, 16.9% pass rush win rate in that span, is fourth among returning power 4 edge defenders. The other edge defender will be Akeem Mesidor, 86.1 PFF grade since joining Miami in 2022. That is second among all returning power 4 edge rushers over the last 3 years of college football. On the interior is redshirt junior Ahmad Moten, who was third among ACC D tackles last year with a 78 pass rush grade. You got sophomore and Justin Scott, who will probably be the other starter next to Ahmad Moten, former 5-star recruit coming out of high school. 73.9 PFF grade on 113 snaps in his true freshman year. And then also, Miami has a couple of former 5-star recruits at edge rusher that are true sophomores in Armando Blunt and Marquise Lightfoot. So a great edge pairing that you have in Ruben Bain Jr. and Akeem Mesidor. You have Ahmad Moten, who's really, really talented pass rusher as well at D tackle. Justin Scott, former 5-star recruit at D tackle, and then a couple former 5-stars in Armando Blunt and Marquise Lightfoot at edge rusher.
Yeah, you mentioned it, and you really like, obviously, Bain is the headliner of the group, and Mesidor, who is someone who played a lot inside last year, could really move around this defensive line. He's absolutely massive. You remember being down at the game when they played Louisville down there. We looked at their defensive line, like, that's a bunch of monsters. That looks like an NFL defensive line. Going to be the same case for this year for Miami. The one big thing is just having Ruben Bain healthy for the whole season, right? The first half of the year really missed with the ankle injury he suffered. I think it was on the third snap of the season against Florida. You get a whole healthy season of Ruben Bain. That's a really good place to start. Then you mentioned Mesidor and some of the other interior guys that they have. It's going to be a good unit. We've been more worried about Miami's secondary than we have about their defensive line. With Bain and those guys up front, they're going to be just fine on the defensive line.
And a lot of versatility, too. Ruben Bain could even play D-tackle for them, too. He's done that before because he's like 280 pounds edge rusher right now, too. So a lot of versatility for Miami and a lot of talent on that defensive line, too, for the Hurricanes. So at number 8 is Miami. At number 7 is Georgia. A little bit of projection here, but Georgia lost a lot of production from their defensive line last year. They do return a star, though, in Kristen Miller at D-tackle, my number 4 D-tackle in college football. He was in the top 20 in the country with an 82.2 PFF grade last year at D-tackle. He's the only player who played 300 snaps for Georgia on the defensive line last year, is back for another year. But they do have a lot of former 5-star recruits ready to take the next step, like Joseph Jonah-Ajayi, Jordan Hall, Elijah Griffin, and Isaiah Gibson. Elijah Griffin, top 5 recruit at true freshman. Isaiah Gibson, believe the number 1 edge rusher in the country coming out of high school, too. So the number 1 D tackle and the number 1 edge rusher both going to Georgia next year. And then they also added a transfer in Elo Modozi at edge rusher from Army. He had 37 pressures last year. That was a top 20 mark in the group of 5. So, yeah, not a lot of experience on Georgia's D-line, but we've seen this time and time again when you think, they lost so much talent from the defensive line. Kirby Smart has like 4 more guys ready to go and become first-round picks for them. So this is more of a kind of a tip of the cap in respect to Kirby Smart. And I still think there's some talent here. Kristen Miller there, and then a lot of former 5-stars too.
There's talent, but it's extremely young talent. This might be the team on the list that I question the most here. Maybe I might have them a few spots lower. There's some more proven units below them, but you mentioned it. And run defense are going to be just fine, right? They're always so sound in run defense. You have Kristen Miller, obviously, C.J. Allen, the great middle linebacker behind him, a top 10 linebacker in the country. But it's a matter of where they're getting the pass rush from. And they struggled a little bit with that last year. When you account for just a defensive lineman, Jalen Walker wasn't a piece of that because we had him officially as a linebacker, and that's what he was. They were in the middle of the pack in the Power 4, 37th out of 70 teams in pass rush grade. So is there going to be any of these young kids? Because Miller's really a run stopper. That's why he's in your top 10 D tackles list, one of the best run stoppers in the country. But who is it that's going to step up as the next great pass rusher at Georgia? That's the question I would have with so much young talent. Talented, of course. Georgia always recruits with the best of them. But I got to find some pass rush if I'm going to take down all these great quarterbacks in the SEC.
It's fair enough, yeah. But Georgia's my number 7 D-line in the country. At number 6 is Michigan, who has 2 players that are my top 10 D tackles and edge rushers list. And they're actually one of 5 schools to do so. So we'll see a lot of more talented defensive lines coming up very soon. Michigan did lose 2 superstars at D tackle in Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant. Both those guys were top 15 picks in the 2025 draft. I still have another great D tackle, though, in Rayshawn Benny, my number 9 D tackle in college football. He was 16th among all D tackles last year with an 83.1 PFF grade. Derek Moore, my number 10 edge rusher in college football. He was 3rd in the nation last year with a 23.4% pass rush win rate. TJ Guy will be the other edge rusher for Michigan next year. He was one of 8 Big Ten edge defenders with 75-plus grades as both a pass rusher and as a run defender. Some other question marks at the other D tackle spot. You got a guy like Trey Williams transferring in from Clemson, who played around 300 snaps for Clemson last year. Damon Payne also transferring in from Alabama. They have some young talent, too, on that defensive line. But I really like the pairing of Rayshawn Benny and Derek Moore. And TJ Guy is a very, very solid starter edge rusher.
Yeah, Michigan's defense is going to be just fine with this defensive line. Look, it wasn't just Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant, even Josiah Stewart. They lost 3. It's impressive to me that they lost 3 really darn good players in the first 3 rounds of the draft, 2 of them first-round picks. And yet they're still this high on the list because of the talent they have. With, you mentioned it, Benny, Guy, and Moore, that's going to be the 3 guys that carry this. Obviously, Wink Martindale's going to be blitzing all over the place like he always does. But I think when you look at this unit, you look at the talent that's still coming back, their defensive line is going to be a serious problem for everybody they play against. I think when you look at their defense on the whole, Michigan's going to be just fine on defense. They're not going to have any issues. It's the other side. We'll get into that a little later in the summer and see where that goes. Number 1 quarterback recruit in the country, obviously could save that part, but their defense is going to be fine. You're going to see a lot of similar elements as last year from Michigan, where if you don't get rid of the ball relatively quickly under that 2.5-second mark, you're going to get your quarterback killed because they got guys coming for them.
And I believe they had the highest graded D-line in the country last year. That was quite literally the only reason why they made a bowl game last year.
Yep.
I mean, they beat Ohio State literally only because of that D-line.
It was so good that, we saw it at even the bowl game against Alabama, and I don't think Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant played in that game, did they?
No, they didn't.
So you're talking about basically this unit that we just talked about were the ones that dominated Alabama in the bowl game, and they couldn't block them. And we talked about them last week as your number 1 O-line in the country, all those guys coming back. So you meant the talent that Michigan has on defense, they're going to be in games every week. They just got to score enough points to support that. It's kind of this backwards thing that we usually talk about with most teams, but Michigan's D-line is still going to be a monster of a unit.
It's disgusting. Yeah, they should have another great D-line next year. Kind of recap the 10 through 6. Honorable mention was Oregon, number 10 Texas, number 9 Oklahoma, number 8 Miami, number 7 Georgia, and number 6 Michigan. Before we get to the top 5 of this list, let's talk about the sponsor for the show. That is Fabric by Gerber Life. What does your child's future success look like to you? A job they're passionate about, traveling around the world, or just being happy and comfortable? Whatever their journey, you can help make it easier to achieve with a kids investment account from Fabric by Gerber Life. By making a contribution to your child's future today, you can help give them the means to pursue the dreams, big and small. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a kids investment account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. It's all online, and setting up an account could take you just 5 minutes. Then you can manage your child's account and monitor their investments right from your phone. Funds can be used for nearly anything benefiting your child, from tuition and tutors to music classes, and when they're adults and out on their own, they can use the funds for anything that they need. Unique gifting lists can be shared with family and friends, so instead of more stuff, they can help grow your child's investments for their future instead. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/pffcollege. Just meetfabric.com/pffcollege. meetfabric.com/pffcollege. Portfolios managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors Incorporated. Additional services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Learn more at meetfabric.com. All right, top 5 of my top 10 defensive lines in college football. At number 5 is the Penn State Nittany Lions. They don't really have the depth of other schools on this list. In fact, Dalton, if you had to ask me right now what's the biggest question mark with the Nittany Lions going next year, I actually might say defensive line depth. The reason why they're here at number 5, though, they have 2 superstars in Zane Durant and Denai Dennis Sutton, the latter being a first-round pick in our way too early 2026 mock draft. Zane Durant, my number 2 D tackle in college football. He led all D tackles in the nation last year with 14 tackles for loss or no gain And he also had 28 pressures, among the 25 most at D-tackle in college football last year as well. Denied Dennis Sutton, like I said before, could be the third straight Penn State edge rusher to go in the first round of a draft, joining the likes of Abdul Carter, obviously, this past year, and Chop Robinson the year before. Since 2023, he has the second most pressures among returning Power 4 edge rushers with 75 pressures, and the second most valuable edge rusher returning in the Power 4 over the last 2 years, according to our wins above average metric, my number 9 edge rusher in the country. That's really it for the proven players on Penn State's defensive line. But I do want to say, keep an eye on redshirt senior Alonzo Ford Jr. at D-tackle. He had a 77.2 run defense grade last year at D-tackle. That was 10th among Big Ten interior defenders with at least 175 snaps. So, yeah, the depth of Penn State isn't great, but they do have 2 stars in Zane Duran and Dennis Sutton.
Absolutely. If I'm reading this right, I think those are the only 2 defensive linemen they have coming back that played at least 200 snaps last year. So that's really the question. You do have 2 spectacular players in Dennis Sutton and Durant, and they're going to be able to rush the passer. And I think the question is going to be, is Jim Knowles going to need to blitz more than he did at Ohio State last year? He was very comfortable, as he should have been, with Ohio State's 4-man rush last year. But is he going to be that comfortable with Penn State this year? If you're only going to have 2 legitimate pass rushers, if that's the case, then are you going to have to blitz more? Are you going to have to get creative? And we know he can get creative. It's just a matter of, I think he does prefer to only send 4. Does he have 4 guys, or I should say really 2 other guys beyond those 2 that he feels that comfortable with? It's going to be something to watch up front, because you mentioned it. Talent, especially at the top end, they certainly have it, but that lack of depth and what we're used to seeing the last 2 or 3 years from Penn State could be a bit of an issue against the better teams on the schedule.
It's definitely an argument for them to be a little lower on this list, but I just love the 2 stars they have
for sure.
in Zane Duran and that's why they're a little bit higher on this list. But the depth is definitely a big question mark for Penn State going into next year outside of those 2 players. Number 4 for me is, I believe, I also have number 4 for O-lines too, right?
You did, yep.
So number 4 for O-line and number 4 for D-line is the Florida Gators, who might have 2 first-round picks on their defensive line between edge defender Tyreek Sapp and D-tackle Caleb Banks. Sapp, my number 7 edge rusher in college football. He was 9th among FBS edges last year with a 90.4 PFF grade. Banks was my honorable mention D-tackle. He leads all returning Power 4 interior defenders with 53 pressures over the last 2 years. They also returned another starter on the D-line in edge defender George Gums, and sophomore D-tackle LJ McCray is expected to break out this year. He was a top 10 overall recruit in the 2024 high school class. So you have 2 guys who could be first-round picks in Tyreek Sapp and Caleb Banks, another returning starter in George Gums, and then a guy in LJ McCray, a true sophomore, who was a top 10 overall recruit coming out of high school. Florida's D-line is loaded next year.
Absolutely. I think to me it starts with Sapp and everything he can do up front. A true 2-way player who can win as a pass rusher or as a run defender, can win out on the edge wide. He can move inside and really defend the run well on early downs, head up on tackles and tight ends. I think that's what he's the one that makes this go, just because you're talking about the versatility and the power that he has. But then you have Banks, whose flashes as a pass rusher are as good as anybody. Just got to be more consistent. The only thing I might question here is maybe a little bit of the interior run defense in certain matchups with, losing Cam Jackson, losing Desmond Watson, right? That's a lot of beef you're losing in there on the inside. But certainly this is a really talented unit that has some depth to it. And you mentioned McCray as the X factor. If he turns into what he's supposed to be and what he was supposed to be as a recruit, obviously, boy, you got a dangerous unit here in Florida that you don't want to mess around with. LSU found that out. Ole Miss found that out. The second half of the year, when they got this D-line rolling, they were tough. They were a tough team to block.
Absolutely, yeah. Florida loaded in the trenches. My number 4 O-line in the country and also my number 4 D-line in the country going into next year. And also, obviously, a very talented quarterback in DJ Lagway returning for another year as well. At number 3.
This is the fun one.
This is a fun one.
This is the fun one.
This is a school that doesn't have any returning starters, I don't believe, I should say. Maybe there is some guys who could be backups, but their entire starting defensive line are all players who didn't even play for this school last year. Texas Tech checks in at number 3 for me on my defensive line rankings. Texas Tech, we mentioned it time and time again, brought in an unreal recruiting transporter class, I should say. Probably the best transporter class of any school in the country. Biggest reason why? The D-line. They really stacked up at D-line. All those guys on that screen right there, all 5 of those players, all of them were transfers coming in this year. Lee Hunter, my number 5 D tackle in college football, 2 dominant years at UCF. Across 2022 and 2023, he leads all FBS D tackles in run defense stops with 59 and with 27 tackles for loss or no gain. Also had 49 pressures in those 2 years. That is second among returning Power 4 D tackles. So dominant player, top 5 D tackle in the country, in my opinion, coming in from UCF. David Bailey, coming in from Stanford, led all edge rushers in college football last year with a 93.2 pass rush grade and had a 27.5% pass rush win rate. That was second among all FBS edge rushers last year. The other edge spot will likely be Romello Height, transferring in from Georgia Tech. He was 10th among all ACC edge rushers last year with a 78.4 PFF grade. Other D tackle will likely be Skylar Gill-Howard, coming in from Northern Illinois, and he was a dominant player for the Huskies. Among Group of 5 D tackles last year, he was 5th with an 83.8 PFF grade, also 5th with 29 pressures, and he was 2nd with 29 or 28 defensive stops too. And then also, they brought in Anthony Holmes Jr. at D tackle from Houston. He was 5th in the Big 12 with 23 defensive stops last year. So again, not a lot of returning talent for Texas Tech on the D-line, but they brought in 5 really, really good transfers on that D-line, and why they're here at number 3 for me.
Well, and those 4 guys are going to start, but they have some guys who at least got some experience last year, even behind them, so they have a decent amount of depth. Guys like Charles Esters and Amir Washington and Jaden Cofield, so they've got some guys who didn't play all that well last year because Texas Tech's defense wasn't very good. But when you mention that front 4, right, Bailey, Height, Gill-Howard, Hunter, if you put those 4 players combined into one PFF grade last year, it was a 90.6. You want the list of Power 4 defensive lines that had at least that?
What?
Michigan, Ole Miss.
Wow.
And that's it. So having him at number 3 here is pretty appropriate. Honestly, when you're talking about Bailey, who had the best pass rush grade in the country, is that right? Or he was up there in the top.
He was, best,
Number 1. Lee Hunter's a great run stopper. Romello Height got a lot better last year at Georgia Tech. And Skylar Gill-Howard just dominating up there at NIU. That front 4 is something no other team in the Big 12 has. Not even close. It's not even close. There's a couple other teams with 1 or 2 guys, right? But this front 4 could be a game changer for Texas Tech. What they did in the portal this year, and they got some receivers, and they got safeties and some other things, but this is the unit I think that they're hoping makes a difference on their defense and makes the rest of the defense better. Those are 4 extremely talented players, especially for me. Bailey's the guy who he could be the best. He could be the best pass rusher in the Big 12.
Oh, easily.
Probably you could already considering what he did at Stanford is pretty much their only great defensive player over there. He could come into Texas Tech and make a huge impact in that entire group. It's going to be fun to watch them because I don't think anybody else has what Texas Tech has on their defensive line. It shows with being number 3 in this list, but when you talk about the Big 12, that's not really loaded with a whole lot of D-lines like this. Texas Tech has the premier unit.
I don't think I had any Big 12 O-lines either in my top 10, right? I don't believe so. So it's going to be
I don't think
tough sledding for the Big 12 next year.
No, well, because most...
Or Utah. Sorry, Utah's number 2.
You did have Utah, but even then, they're known more as the run. And that I'm not sure that we'll have to take a look at Texas Tech's schedule here, but you're talking about Utah's known also more for the run blocking, right? So maybe it's the counter that comes in with this Texas Tech, but they got good run stoppers too. And you talk about Gill-Howard and Hunter, so I mean it's going to be a lot of fun to watch if this front 4 maybe even more so than anything offensively, and they've got some talent offensively, especially on the outside. But, well, here's the fun one. Their first Big 12 game this year at Utah.
Oh, hell yeah.
So we're already
the matchup to watch.
We're already getting the preview going. We're getting the preview ready right now, week 4 at Utah. But that's whichever one of us has it, that's what it's going to be. But you're going to find out very early in the season in that game at Utah if this Texas Tech defensive line is for real. But the amount of talent and what they did last year darn well deserve to be this high on the list.
They got a massive influx of NIL recently, and they really attacked the transfer portal this past year, and the D-line, they were especially really attacked in the portal. Texas Tech checks in at number 3 on this list. If you wonder why in the thumbnail you saw a Stanford player in the thumbnail, it's not because Stanford has a top defensive line in the country. It's because one of their top players, David Bailey, transferred to Texas Tech, and Texas Tech's entire D-line is basically made up of transfers right now, which is why they're here at number 3 on my list. At number 2 is Alabama, my number 1 O-line in the country, my number 2 D-line in the country next year. Really, a lot of it because of 2 players, and LT Overton and Tim Keenan III. Both those guys could have been entering the 2025 NFL draft, but they decided to return to Tuscaloosa for another year. Overton really had a breakout year after transferring in from Texas A&M. Kind of a disappointing couple years at A&M.
Heard that a lot.
After being a former 5-star recruit, he ended his junior year as one of the 15 most valuable edge rushers in the country last year, according to our wins above average metric. He's my number 6 edge rusher in college football. Tim Keenan III, my number 3 D tackle in the country. He was 3rd among all Power 4 D tackles with a 90.1 run defense grade last year. And the only 2 that were ahead of him were Mason Graham and Walter Nolan. Those 2 were top 20 picks in the 2025 NFL draft. They also brought back 3 players who played 300 snaps for them on the defensive line last year: an edge defender, Marion Latham, edge defender, Qua Rusaw, and interior defensive lineman, James Smith. All 3 of them earned at least a 65 PFF grade last year. I do want to shout out to Keon Keeley, was I believe the number 2 overall recruit coming out of high school. Has not really played that much in his first couple years at Alabama, but was a very highly touted recruit coming out of high school. He might factor in a little bit more this year as well. But really the reason why Alabama's number 2 on this list is because you have 2 guys who are superstars in LT Overton and Tim Keenan III.
Yeah, I think what stands out to me with Alabama's defensive line, especially with Overton and Keenan, and then even some of those other complimentary guys you mentioned, good luck running on this team. This is maybe the best run-stopping defensive line in college football. I mean, I know we've got another one ahead of them that's pretty darn good too, but Alabama, when you just look at trying to run between the tackles, you're not going to get many teams, even in the SEC, they're going to be able to do it. I think that the big question for me is Overton's going to improve, I think, as a pass rusher. Who's that second guy? Q Robinson was like that a little bit last year in a part-time role. He was the guy who had the big 90 pass rush grade, but somebody else has to step up to me, whether it's inside or outside, as a second legitimate pass rusher. But I think that's what gets them this high on the list is obviously they have a boatload of talent. They're Alabama. They're always recruiting well, but what they can do in run defense, they are lights. They don't need any safety help or anything like that. And then you got Deontay Lawson, the Kai Hill Green, guys like that behind him at linebacker. This Alabama run defense has a chance to be the best in the country.
This could be dominant next year, Alabama. And they have a number 2 D line in the country, a lot of it because of LT Overton and Tim Keenan III coming back next year, who could be very high picks in the NFL draft, in my opinion, next year. But number 1 on this list, and for me, pretty easy number 1, is the Clemson Tigers, who not only could have 2 high picks in the NFL draft, could have 2 top 5, top 10 picks in the NFL draft in D tackle Peter Woods and edge rusher TJ Parker. Peter Woods, my number 1 defensive tackle in college football, entering next year. He leads all returning Power 4 D tackles with an 89.7 run defense grade and a 14.9% pass rush win rate over the last 2 years. So you can argue that Peter Woods is the best run defender and the best pass rusher that we have at D tackle over the last 2 years. TJ Parker, my number 3 edge defender in college football and the number 1 edge defender eligible for the 2026 NFL draft. He leads all returning Power 4 edge rushers with 12 sacks last year, and he was one of only 3 returning Power 4 edge rushers who had an 80-plus grade as both a pass rusher and as a run defender. So those 2 alone are really enough for Clemson to be number 1 on this list. They also added in Purdue edge defender Will Helt. He was 4th among Big Ten edge rushers last year with 36 defensive stops. DeMonte Capehart and Stephylan Green are both back at D tackle too. They each earned 70-plus PFF grades last year. And then Cade Denhoff and Jaheim Lawson provide some depth at edge rusher. They each played over 300 snaps last year. And Clemson brought in a 5-star D tackle and Amari Adams, who will be a true freshman next year too. But really, Dawn, the reason why they're number 1 on this list is because they have 2 guys who I think are right now top 5 prospects on our big board in Peter Woods and TJ Parker.
When you're number 1 on a list like this, on a unit list, it's a combination of top-end talent and depth, and even all those depth guys you mentioned, Capehart and everybody else behind it. Also, bringing in Helt. Okay, so we're good. Peter Woods going to play on the inside full-time this year. Okay,
so,
right?
Yeah.
We're done with Peter Woods, edge defender. We're done with I hope so, because he's at his best on the inside.
And he's still like an 80 grade playing out of position too. too.
Sure.
Shows how crazy.
Absolutely, but he could be the best D tackle in the country, or you have him ranked right now as the best D tackle in the country. Just leave him in there. You got to find some other guys to play off the edge. But either way, I mean, top end talent, depth, dominance, everything you could ask for. One of several reasons Clemson may have the best defense in the country this year is they do, going into the season, have the best D line in the country, and you mentioned it, with two of the most talented players in the 2026 class. There's only so much we can keep saying about Clemson. Their defense is going to be fantastic. It starts up front. They got 3 waves of it, but the first one is really, really darn good. That's why they're at the top of this list.
Absolutely. Clemson, pretty easy number 1 because of 2 superstars they have in that D-line, but they also have some really good depth, too, adding in a guy like, well, how about Clemson adding in a transfer, too? Shout out to Dabo Swinney for getting with the times a little bit there.
We're progressing.
Yeah.
Here, We're just
baby steps.
Just a little bit of portal, a little bit of NIL. We're getting.
It's not quite Texas Tech, but it's baby steps for Dabo Swinney. I'm proud of him.
That's a big step.
I'm proud of him for that. I am proud of him for that. But yeah, DeMonte Capehart and Stephon Green are pretty good D tackles too. But those 2 players at the top, man, and Peter Wood, C.J. Parker, I really think both those guys will at least be top 10 picks in next year's draft. And you can make an argument both of them could be top 5 picks in next year's draft too. Just to recap, my top 10 honorable mention was Oregon, number 10, Texas, number 9, Oklahoma, number 8, Miami, number 7, Georgia, number 6, Michigan, number 5, Penn State, number 4, Florida, number 3, Texas Tech, number 2, Alabama, and number 1, Clemson for my top 10 D-lines in college football. Dalton, anything you would change with this top 10? I know Georgia's a little high for you, but anything else that you would change on this list?
That's probably the one for me. Is I would have Georgia probably a couple spots lower, maybe at number 10 or even as the honorable mention. Of course, they always have a lot of talent, and I'm going to say this, and then Georgia's going to go into the season and be like, oh, here's 4 new really young defensive linemen who are great, but it's just kind of unproven, less proven, I think, than any other team on this list. And then the thought I was having is just, man, there was some really good units that just get squeezed out of here.
Yeah,
I mean, when you look at some of the D lines we have in college football, I think about Dylan Stewart still in South Carolina. I know they lost a lot, but you still have Stewart and Brian Thomas Jr. down there at South Carolina. You've got Indiana and Michael Kamara and those guys. You've got Tennessee with Josh Josephs and the hockey waves that they bring with you and all that depth they have at Tennessee. I mean, there's some really good units that got left off of here, and I think Missouri's also got a pretty good unit themselves. I mean, there's just so many defensive lines. Auburn and Keldrick Falk, they were the 7th highest graded D-line in the Power 4 last year, and Keldrick Falk might be a first-round pick. So a lot of really good units that get left out of here, but it just shows you the amount of defensive line talent that we have right now in college football.
I want to shout out 2 more. They are actually the 2 next ones for me on this list. Texas A&M has a really good D-line going into next year. Cassius Howe, I think, is going to be a breakout star at edge rusher for them next year. Albert Regis back at D-tackle. He's a really solid D-tackle for them, too. And then Tyler Onyedim, transferring in from Iowa State, was a really good player in 2023 at Iowa State that year. And then the other one who's really hard to leave off was actually Iowa. Iowa has a really good D-line.
Solid.
Really good D-line. Aaron Graves at D-tackle, my number 6 D-tackle in college football. Max Llewellyn was a really good edge rusher, had an 89.9 PFF grade for us last year. And then Ethan Hurkett had an 82.5 PFF grade last year too. So Iowa and Texas A&M were 2 of the hardest schools for me to leave off the list. And you mentioned before, leaving off a defensive line that features Dylan Stewart is very hard. I know they have a lot of other question marks on the D-line right now outside of Brian Thomas Jr. But yeah, Dylan Stewart's a superstar, my number 2 edge rusher in the country. Just the D-tackle spot is really a big question mark right now. You have a guy who played 16 snaps last year for A&M, and Gabriel Brownlow-Dindy going to start one of them, and then Xavion Hardy is going to be the other starter. He's the number 1 player coming out of JUCO this past year, but if you have Dylan Stewart, you're probably going to be pretty up on the list.
Yeah, no, and that's why it's a unit ranking, right? Because you need all 4 of those spots filled up front, or some teams go with 3 or whatever, whatever front you're running. But it's also about the depth, and I think that's why a lot of these teams, especially when you look at Clemson, Alabama, Texas Tech, even bringing some guys, at least some decent guys back from last year, Florida, and the depth that they have. I think that's really what makes the difference here. Is you're gonna have 1 or 2 superstars, but like we talked about with the offensive line, you got 1 or 2 weaknesses up there. Teams are going to find it. Really good offenses are going to find it, and they're going to attack that weakness. So I think that's what keeps some of those teams off, but there's some talent. We got a lot of defensive line talent in college football right now.
Definitely. All right, that wraps up my top 10 defensive lines in college football entering the 2025 season. On Thursday, we'll be going over my top 10 linebacker units in college football next year. Which schools are the best positioned at linebacker going into next year. That'll be on Thursday. Make sure you guys subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single video. For Dalton Wassman, for our producer Eli back there, it's actually his birthday today as of recording this. So make sure you guys shout out Eli in the chat, wish him a happy birthday. That wraps up our top 10 D lines in the country, and on Thursday, our top 10 linebacker units in the country. So subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our videos coming out very soon.